Hi, I'm John Schmitz, history professor at Northern Virginia Community College, Annandale campus, and I'm excited to be here. My book is called Enemies Among Us, and it has to do with the relocation, internment, and repatriation of German, Italian, and Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Way back in the 1980s, I got interested in the topic because my father and his family were interned as German Americans during World War II. I had no idea really much about it. I'd heard a little bit about the Japanese Americans, but found out from my dad that he was actually interned for 3 years along with my grandparents, his brother, one aunt, his sister, and then I had another aunt who was actually born in Crystal City internment camp during the war. They were interned from the summer of 1943 to the summer of 1946. And if you know anything about World War II history, the war ends in Europe in May of 1945. So they were actually in Crystal City camp, which didn't close, by the way, until summer of 1948. And some internees languished in camps until the summer of 1949. So I got interested in this because it was family history, and I wanted to know more about why my father and his family were interned. So my grandparents came over in the 1920s from Germany, mid to late 20s, and they just never naturalized. They just didn't think it important to become citizens. So when the United States went to war against Nazi Germany and Japan and Italy right after Pearl Harbor, they became by definition what are called enemy aliens. And then there was a series of 4 acts passed way back in 1798, and one of them was the Alien Enemies Act, which has been in the news now in 2025 as of late. And that was a statutory authority for the arrest and detention and later on expulsion of my father and his family. My father was a citizen. He was born in the United States. And they lived up in New York City at the time. And the FBI had lists of people. This went to the Registration Act in the summer of 1940. So millions of aliens were feared because of who they were and where they came from. There were at least 5 million who were registered that summer. And the hunt for subversives, for enemies within, for what later on were called fifth columnists, began in the early to mid 1930s. Once Hitler took power, once Germany began grabbing territory with the war in Asia, the United States wanted to be prepared. So we started to create lists. What Hoover, who was a director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, created a list. It was called the Custodial Detention List. And it had millions of names of normal types of people on it. So in case we went to war, which by the late 30s became more likely, especially after Germany invaded Poland in 1939, so we would have people to lock up. And part of the thought with internment is that there were Americans who were trapped abroad as Germany expanded and Japan expanded. And we would need potentially people here to swap for those persons. So my research is I'm interested in social justice issues, how people are treated, civil liberties. And what I found is that fear and hatred are really powerful forces. And we're seeing those, unfortunately, again today, when people are stereotyped, vilified. We're taught to fear and hate certain groups of people just because. And what I found was there were 2 processes. There was relocation and internment. So well over 100,000 Japanese were removed from the West Coast, but also tens of thousands of Germans were as well. And then tens of thousands of Germans were relocated from the East Coast. And what shielded people from either relocation and internment were just numbers. So for example, on the Hawaiian Islands, the Japanese made up something like 38% of the population, and you just can't intern that many people. The same logic applied to Germans and Italians throughout the United States. There were millions of Germans and Italians, aliens and citizens. So the government thought we would deal with the largest threat, or what we perceived as the largest threat, Japanese Americans first, and then more so with Germans and Italians. And I think it's just a fascinating story of what can happen in what I call a democracy under stress, when you add fear and hatred, racism, you combine all that, and then most Americans thought what happened was proper, and some in fact thought we should have interned or relocated more people, and that those who were interned and relocated really wouldn't much mind doing that as a sacrifice to the country. And during the course of the war, thousands of ordinary people were exchanged. So it's a really, I think, a fascinating look at the United States when it's under stress. From Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942 to the Korematsu case in 1944, and the widespread support of government policies that impacted hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans. And what was tragic is families like mine lost their jobs, they lost their possessions, they had to start over, and there were many internees who committed suicide, who felt that they had been loyal to this country and were somehow now being called enemies. And they would lose their job, lose their property, and spend months or years behind barbed wire. One of the points I wanted to make as well in thinking about this time period is that these camps should not be confused with so-called concentration camps, or what Germany had as Arbeitslagers, work-to-death camps. The Geneva Convention was applied. Crystal City, where my father and his family were interned, had a swimming pool. They had recreational facilities. The camp commandant, Joseph O'Rourke, tried to keep conditions as good as possible, from food to medicine, healthcare, sporting events, recreational events, those kinds of things. But still, there was barbed wire. And Crystal City, like many of the dozens and dozens and dozens of camps and facilities nationwide, it was behind barbed wire and out in the middle of nowhere. So even though it was a gilded cage, it was still a cage. My dad at age 7, 8, 9, 10 remembered going to school, having fun, swimming in the pool. But the internment really impacted teenagers and adults, many of whom would have bouts of depression, and then many of whom really had a tough time post-war. And then the book, I think, Enemies Among Us, is so much more relevant in today's world because once again, we're seeing threats abroad and at home. The current administration is pushing against civil rights and civil liberties, dehumanizing human beings and using fear and hatred to target certain groups of people. And as historians, we know that the product of those policies can lead to very bad things. How far, who knows, in the future is anybody's guess. But this, to me, is what makes history so fascinating and so relevant, that you can have an act like the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, and even though you think that was 1798, what does it have to do with today? These acts are impactful because they're still there. The Sedition Act, Espionage Act, they were used in the Civil War, they were used in World War I, they were used in World War II, and some of them are being used again today. So the book is sort of a cautionary tale, and regardless, I think, of one's ethics or morals, we're called to love our neighbor, which means all people as individuals and without exception. So this is why I'm so interested in this topic, and I hope you will be as well. Thank you.